Hello and welcome to the Bible Notebook with me, Jacob Taylor, in association with Christians in the Chamber. In today's first episode, we'll be talking about the first chapter of Jonah and the story of our and Jonah's disobedience, but God's ultimate provision for us. Okay, to begin with, I'd like to quickly read through the chapter and then unpack it a little bit and see what meaning can be brought out for us today. So this is from the New International Version translation of the Bible, chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose, and the ship threatened to break up. All of the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw their cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, and we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord, because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon us." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried to the Lord, "O Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and they threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, to unpack it a little bit. Many of us will be very familiar with the story of Jonah. It is generally one of those stories that is covered at Sunday school or whatever similar thing. Sometimes you'll have it in school as well, I think during RE lessons or during assemblies if you go to a Catholic or Church of England controlled school. I definitely heard this story quite a lot. Ultimately, this is an excellent example of how disobedience to the will of God and how disobedience of that can lead to consequences not only for ourselves but also for those around us. It really lays open how sin is not only a personal thing but really a societal. It's a thing that affects everything around us. When one person sins, there are many more people who are affected. And sin is basically disobedience. And so we see here that Jonah's disobedience has a great effect on the lives of the sailors he ends up fleeing with. So I'm going to dive straight into this. We see quite clearly at the beginning of the word that the word of the Lord came to Jonah, and it said, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it." Quite clearly there, God has laid out what he wants Jonah to do. Sometimes in life, God can lay out quite clearly what he wants us to do. Sometimes it can be a bit more cryptically laid out. But we see here, quite clear, Jonah, do X, Y, and Z. And what do we see? The verse straight after, "But Jonah ran away from the Lord." And it says then at the end, where he's paying his fare, etc., says to flee from the Lord. And one of these great, really slightly funny concept is this idea that you can run away from God when God is omnipresent, when he's everywhere. And the idea that you can, on earth, escape him is rather ridiculous, considering he's the guy who made it all. And he is everywhere. And I think that's it's a great comfort for us. But it's also an interesting fact that quite often in our lives we can be like Jonah. God can say something to us. We can want to flee from the Lord. We want to flee away from what he has commanded us to do. But ultimately you can't escape him. And when it comes to this issue of obedience and Jonah wanting to flee, I think it's really important to remember that when God's told you to do something, you can't really escape him, and it's really important that you do that which he has told you. And yeah, I just found it really funny that Jonah, obviously he must have known the Exodus story. He must have known just the general history of the Jews through Genesis, Exodus, etc. And he still thinks he can flee from God. And so then we see consequences straight away. Verse 4, and the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and a violent storm rose, and the ship threatened to break up. And we see here quite clearly there is consequences to the actions that we take. I think that's an important thing to remember, is that we are always, no matter our actions, whether they are good or bad, they always have a consequence. And I think here, unless you have really minuscule consequences, I guess sort of if you ate something for breakfast that wasn't exactly healthy, your heart might not be the best condition, but it's not going to be massive, but there is a little consequence there. And here we see with Jonah, there's a massive consequence of what he does. And what are people's response to this great wind arising? We see here that every sailor was afraid, and each cried out to his own God. This is a really interesting point. We see throughout Old Testament people crying out to their own God. In Kings, it discusses about how the prophets of Baal, or Baal, how you want to pronounce that word, how they cried out to Baal to be like, mate, send some fire down, and nothing happened. And I think it's quite interesting that when we look at those gods in the Bible that aren't the Lord, they are completely ineffective and nothing happens. We see in 1 Samuel when the Ark of the Covenant is taken to the towns of the Philistines, and when they're in the temple of Dagon falls flat on his face before the Ark, because ultimately these other gods that we have can't do anything. I think a modern application of this is very simply to things like money or status or power. We can quite easily try to chase after these things, and we can, when things go bad, we can be like, money, what's going on? I'm going to spend more money, or I'm going to try and save more, and that's going to help me, or I'm going to invest more wisely, or I'm going to make sure I have enough power, then have enough friendships, so they can all support me. But ultimately what we see is that chasing after all these things leads to nothing, and they might provide short-term happiness, they may help us a little bit, but they don't solve problems. And we see here the Lord solving problems, and so they're calling out to their gods, and they're like, Jonah, why are you still asleep? Jonah's quite oddly asleep, and they said that maybe he will take notice of us and we will not perish. And this is one of the things I love about the Lord, is that he always takes notice of us. We have that direct communication with him through Jesus dying and rising again. That sort of that split between us and God is no longer there, because Jesus died for us, and we can live in. It's really important to live in that acceptance of that, and the fact that we can call on God when things are getting rough and be like, God, help us out. What's going on? And I think there were maybe he will take notice of us. I think God always takes notice of us. There's no maybe about it. I think we see throughout Scripture that there are moments when people are praying and God breaks in. there are moments in our lives when we're praying, God breaks in. It might not always seem like the way that we want God to break in, but God's going to break into our situations. I think we need to live in faith of that. It's one of the great privileges we have, that we have a God who we can lay our worries at the feet of, and he will gladly pick them up and sort them out. And so we see here that they're praying, they're like, heck, what's going on? And then we get a bit further on to verse 11, and they say, the sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? I think Jonah's response here is so important, because he understands the sense of justice that needs to occur. He realizes that he has sinned against the Lord, and the only way to repay that sin is death. We see in Romans, the wages of sin are death. Is death. Wages of sin are death. Is death, yeah. And we see here that realization by Jonah of, like, I've caused all these issues, I've sinned against the Lord. Realistically, the only thing that's left for me to do now is to die. And we see, and this is what I find utterly amazing about Jesus, is that he then says, no, the wages of sin are death. That's very true. But if you believe in me, you can be saved and have eternal life. And we see him saying that time and again. I just finished reading the Gospel of John, and he goes on about it quite a lot. And I think that's such an amazing thing, that we have this God who came down and provided a way for us to not die, essentially. Obviously, it's not physical death still happens, but it's about spiritual death, that kind of thing. And I think that's so cool. But what we see in Jonah is that realization that we should all have of ourselves, is that our sin leads to death. And so Jonah's like, right, in that case, throw me in. But and we see really interesting here, verse 13, instead, the men did their best to row back to land. And I think this is so emblematic of the struggles we can sometimes have in our own life, where we cause problems, and we don't give them up to the Lord, and instead we try to row our way out of these issues. And I think that's so the wrong thing to do. We see here that there is clearly a solution, but we're like, no, that seems a really difficult solution. It's not. If the solutions that God gives us are not always easy. I think sometimes we can be tricked into thinking that Christian life is going to be super easy, and that God's going to provide solutions for everything. It's going to be all blessings, but sometimes it's difficult, and decisions you have to make are difficult. Sometimes you have to sacrifice things. You have to give up stuff. And what we see here is that the men were like, no, don't want to take the difficult option, and so I'm going to try and row and use our own efforts to save ourselves. And I think this is so emblematic of that we cannot save ourselves. And it's so evident here that our own actions are completely insufficient against this idea of justice and of a just God, that we ourselves are completely powerless. And I think this is something that maybe Luther had such a great grasp of, is that as humans we are completely powerless to earn our own salvation and to earn our own place in heaven. But that's why Jesus came down and he died for us, so we can get up there. And it always continue blows my mind. So continuing further on, we're nearly finished the end of Jonah. And we see him thrown overboard. But verse 17, but the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. But the Lord provided. I think that is currently the story of the season that I'm going through at the moment. I'm away. I'm currently abroad, working, and I'm just seeing God's provision in everything. And it's an amazing thing to be living through. It's sometimes a little bit, it can be stressful, but it's about giving up every day to him, and he provides. And I think what we see here is the Lord provides for Jonah, even though he was so disobedient. And I think that is just the complete compassionate nature of God, is that even though we completely go against what he wants, we completely go against all his principles or his commands, we decide to go and leg it in the opposite direction sometimes, he was still, he had so much compassion for us that he came down and he provided a solution for us. And he provided a safety net for us. He provides what we need in those scenarios, in those situations. And we see here, despite Jonah's disobedience, God provides. It might always look like how we think God's provided. It might be, for us, it might be like, oh, we want God to calm the storm. Maybe that's going to be the way to provide. But instead, I don't think Jonah was thinking about getting swallowed by a massive fish when he was thrown overboard. But God provides a solution. That's what he had decided. And I think we need to be acceptant of the fact that that God provides in ways we don't always understand. And sometimes that's hard, and it's going to be really difficult, especially when we're in certain seasons of life, certain situations. It can be really difficult to understand why things are happening and why God. It doesn't may not even seem like God's providing for us, but He is. But it may not seem the way we want it to, or something like that. And we need to be always mindful of the fact that He is providing for us, but it doesn't always look how we want it. So that's the first chapter of Jonah. It may have been a little bit rambly. But what we see here is, like, I've written down some points very simply. We see that Jonah 1 tackles disobedience and the effects of such disobedience. So we see that Jonah is given a command by God. He disobeys and flees. He brings trouble down on more people. Ultimately, he understands justice, and people try to avoid the bad, the sort of the icky solution they're given, which makes things worse. But ultimately, God provides, and no one dies. And it's just so emblematic of God's absolute love for us and His absolute compassion for us, that He provides for us even in the depth of our sin and disobedience. So that was the first Bible notebook on the first chapter of Jonah. I hope it's been very useful for you. Along with this video, I'm going to put up the notes that I had on this, a sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points I had, 7, 8 maybe, on this first chapter. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like and subscribe. I mean, don't subscribe, you can't really subscribe on Facebook. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope this can be a weekly thing. I intend to make it a weekly thing. So yeah, have a blessed week.